heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 315, covering the week through July 4th through July 8th, 2022. Glad to have you back in the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. On those YouTube videos, if you look at that little button under the video, it looks like a little heart. It's a Super Thanks button. If you like any of our YouTube videos, you can click on that Super Thanks button, and you can throw a few pennies our way that way. And of course, you can always donate to the Abbeville Institute by going to abbevilleinstitute.org. That's Abbeville, institute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition by 20 Abbeville Institute scholars. And of course, click on that donate button, and you can throw a few pennies our way. You can throw as much as you would like, as much or as little as you like. We do exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like the podcast, the website, the conferences, the videos, all the stuff that we do, it does cost money to do all these things. And so please consider that tax-deductible donation to the Institute. We cannot survive without you providing financial support. So that's very important. Also, you can share our material around on social media. Even though we're not on Facebook, you can still share our articles on Facebook. And of course, that's a great way to let people know what we're doing. Of course, this week was our summer school week. So while I'm recording this, we're sitting at the summer school in beautiful Seabrook Island, South Carolina. So that, of course, is a great event. We'll have the videos from that up sometime in the near future. We're excited about getting those to you. But we do have a new video for Abbeville U that's up this week. And so that's one of the things that your donations help contribute to and produce. We did have our Zoom webinar last week with Brandon Meeks. That's at Abbeville Academy. Go to abbevilleacademy.org. If you missed any of those, you can pick up those old webinars. So all these things are great ways to support the Institute. Buying those old webinars, supporting the webinars, providing a donation. Also, clicking on the shop tab at abbevilleinstitute.org, get our logo and all kinds of cool stuff. That's a great way to support the Institute. Downloading our free mobile app. Again, free of charge to you. Of course, it isn't free to us, so if you do like that as well, consider a donation. Well, let's talk about the material for the week. And again, it is 4th of July week. Now, in the South, 4th of July, particularly in Vicksburg, we don't have an article on it this week, but people in Vicksburg didn't celebrate 4th of July for a generation. That's because that's when Vicksburg fell. And of course, Vicksburg was mercilessly bombarded by the Union gunboats. People were living in literal caves to try to avoid the shelling. And even people going out to do their laundry or cook a meal were killed. Civilians. I mean, these were civilians that were killed. Charleston suffered through a tremendous amount of shelling, too, for over a year. The churches were used as targets. And then, of course, the Union gunboats just shelled the city mercilessly for no reason. The city had basically already given up. I mean, this was the type of activity that's going on in the South. And, of course, also in early July, we had Gettysburg in 1863. And so a lot of things happened in the war in the 1860s. But July 4th, for a long time in the South, was a purely Southern holiday. You think about the people that would celebrate it, mostly the Jeffersonians, the Jeffersonian Republicans. Now, Federalists would often celebrate George Washington's birthday, which, of course, is also a very Southern day. But Federalists would celebrate Washington's birthday, Republicans July 4th, and that's because July 4th was seen as Independence Day. It was the spirit of independence, the spirit of secession, the spirit of self-determination, self-government. All of these things were wrapped into that. And Southerners in 1861 thought they were doing exactly the same thing in leaving the Union. It was in the same spirit of self-determination. We know that a lot of the members of the founding generation from the South had, of course, descendants fight in that war, including George Washington, including Thomas Jefferson. And I mean, this is so important to understand the continuity between these things. We wouldn't have, in Virginia in particular, you had many men who fought for the South that were directly descendant from important members of the founding generation in Virginia. And you had some of that in the North, too. There's no question about that. But you had a lot more immigrant soldiers and recently arrived Americans fighting in the Northern armies than you did in the Southern armies. So it was the South was purely American, and I think that's something we need to understand. Independence Day is Secession Day. Now, a lot of the focus on Independence Day is on Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Jefferson's role in the founding and writing the Declaration of Independence. And of course, people would say that Jefferson was a hypocrite for writing all men are created equal and then fathering children with Sally Hemings. Now, the first piece we had this week wasn't really a piece. It's one of these Abbeville U videos we produce. It features Mark Andrew Holacek talking about the Jefferson-Hemings affair, or myth would be more accurate. The Jefferson-Hemings myth. And I think this is important to get out there. And we put it out on July 4th simply because this is a pervasive myth that has no historical basis. Now, you could say, well, what about the DNA tests? The DNA test said that a Jefferson male fathered children with Sally Hemings, but the historical evidence, as Holacek points out, doesn't point to Thomas Jefferson. It, in fact, probably points to somebody else in his family. Commenters on this video brought up the fact that there was a 1 in 27th chance that it was Jefferson himself. 1 out of 27. And in fact, somebody else said that they had been told that there were more people that had this Y-type strand in Virginia than people realized, because that was a very prominent DNA strand in Virginia because of the prominence of the Jeffersons. But the fact remains, Jefferson, as being pegged as the father of all of Sally Hemings' children, which is what you see now. He fathered all of Sally Hemings' children. Well, this is just ridiculous. There's no evidence of that. The DNA evidence points to one person, Eston Hemings, potentially as being a son of Thomas Jefferson, but that would be it. And we know, again, the evidence surrounding the historical evidence, as Holacek points out in the video, and I'm not going to go through it here because I want you to watch the video. It's very well done. We're doing more of these, but I want you to go watch this video. It's only 8 minutes long. And the idea is to push back against all of this ridiculous garbage that's out there that just conclusively proves that Jefferson was a father of Sally Hemings' children. It's just not there. And so that's one of our contributions. Again, these things aren't free to do. They do cost quite a little bit of money. So if you like them, consider that donation to the Institute so we can do more. These little 7, 8, 10-minute videos. This is our way of trying to educate the public on different parts of the Southern tradition. And we have more planned, but it does take more money. So consider that donation. All right, so the next pieces in the week, some interesting stuff. On Tuesday, we ran a piece by Tom DiLorenzo, who, in fact, is speaking at our summer school as I'm doing this. Tom DiLorenzo wrote a piece about Lincoln and the Declaration. Again, published at the 4th of July at LouRockwell.com. We ran it on Tuesday. And so that's an interesting piece because, Lincoln makes, on July 4th, 1861, he makes a very famous or infamous public message, writes one to Congress. It's a message to Congress where he defends his actions of the previous year, or the previous few months, I should say, and also makes his legal case that secession is illegal and unconstitutional. And what DiLorenzo does in this piece, I think very well, is take apart that entire argument. And what do I mean by that? DiLorenzo goes in and says, look, Lincoln was undermining the original principles of the Declaration of Independence. Undermining them. And he's undermining them because he doesn't really believe in any of it, right? He doesn't believe in any of it at all. In fact, the title is Lincoln's Repudiation of the Declaration of Independence. And I love the first line. He says, perhaps the biggest falsehood ever peddled about Abraham Lincoln is that he was devoted to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Now, where do people get this? People get this because of Harry Jaffa, as DiLorenzo points out. But they also get it because Lincoln himself would often say that he was in direct line to Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration. In fact, Lincoln didn't really talk a whole lot about Alexander Hamilton. He talked a lot about Thomas Jefferson. He thought of himself as believing in the principles of the Declaration. But when you look at what that thing actually does, what the Declaration actually did, and where Lincoln falls in on that, as DiLorenzo points out, there's nothing there. So he says, Lincoln invented a bizarre new theory of the American founding to justify his destruction of the voluntary union of the Founding Fathers that was initiated by the Declaration of Independence, their declaration of secession from the British Empire. As summarized by legal constitutional scholar James Ostrowski, Lincoln's absurd theory was that 1. No state may ever secede from the Union for any reason. 2. If any state secedes, the federal government shall invade such state with sufficient military force to suppress its secession. 3. The federal government may require all states to raise militias to suppress the secession of their sister states. 4. After suppressing secession, the federal government may rule by martial law until such time as the states accept federal supremacy. 5. The federal government may force the states to adopt new state constitutions imposed on them at gunpoint by military authorities. And 6. The president may, on his own authority and without consulting any other branch of government, suspend the Bill of Rights and the writ of habeas corpus. Now, that last point, point number 6, is really important. And it's really important because this was one thing that Lincoln opponents zeroed in on during the war. In 1861, Lincoln suspends habeas corpus unilaterally. And the Congress will go through contortions to try to justify it later on. What do I mean by that? They went in session and they passed legislation validating Lincoln's unconstitutional act. In fact, the ability to suspend habeas corpus is confided entirely in the Congress. It's in Article 1. It's not in Article 2 or Article 3. It's in Article 1. Certainly Article 2 would be the president's powers, and it's not there. Now, Lincoln's argument is, and others would say, well, but, there's some legislative powers in the Article 2, and then also in Article 1, when it talks about vetoing, the president has powers there, so they bleed into it. Well, what they're doing, they clearly define that this is the executive's power in that power of veto. In the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, that's not there. Nothing. It is a power given to the Congress, not to the president. It's very clear. And so this is where the Lincoln regime, because that's what it was, got in a little hot water. And that is where Lincoln was really the most egregious when it came to destroying the Constitution. Now, his arguments against secession are sophomoric at best. His arguments against secession in the indissoluble union of indestructible states. This is Salmon P. Chase in the Texas v. White decision. That's just simply echoing Lincoln. This is a complete distortion of the original Union. But Lincoln does it anyways, July 4th, 1861. And so, as DiLorenzo points out, this is a complete antithesis of the Declaration of Independence. As DiLorenzo says, no state would have ever ratified the Constitution if this, Lincoln's ridiculous and tyrannical new theory, is what the citizens of the state thought the Constitution said. And it's true. In fact, the case of state powers was the most important thing that opponents of the Constitution brought up. It was going to emasculate the states. And they were told over and over again, that's not the case. That wasn't going to happen. So this is why the Constitution was ratified. But DiLorenzo also does a really interesting job, and he points out the charges against King George III and then how Lincoln was going through and doing all this stuff. For example, dissolve representative houses repeatedly. Lincoln imposed military rule on the occupied South during the war. Made judges dependent on his will alone. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. Lincoln illegally suspended habeas corpus and ordered the mass arrest of tens of thousands of suspected Northern political dissenters. Under King Lincoln, soldiers threatened and even kidnapped judges to prevent them from issuing the writ. He has erected a multitude of new officers and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. DiLorenzo says myriad new bureaucracies were created by the Lincoln regime to occupy the South, and federal soldiers pillaged, plundered, and raped their way through the South from the very beginning of the war. Of course, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies. This is Reconstruction, as DiLorenzo points out. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving their assent to their acts of pretended legislation. And DiLorenzo says Lincoln essentially abolished civil liberties in the North and the occupied South, blockaded southern ports, started a war without consent of Congress, and myriad other things that historian Clinton Rossiter said were considered by nobody as legal. This is true. Imposing taxes on without their consent. Lincoln, Southerners not consent to the 1861 Moral Tariff, a main cause of the war in the first place, et cetera, et cetera. So he does a nice job of listing these things in the Declaration, where Lincoln was doing exactly what George III was doing in 1861 compared to 1776. So, I mean, this is a nice piece for that. Now, the other thing, of course, that the Lincoln myth does, it provides cover for the proposition nation. And about a year ago, yours truly was involved in a debate with Michael Anton at the American Greatness website. Anton, of course, is a West Coast Straussian, and Anton was a part of the Trump administration, and he is someone who was very proud of the 1776 Commission report, written by his friends and others. So Anton didn't like the fact that I took apart the 1776 Commission report in Chronicles magazine. Well, he responded, and I didn't realize this, but Robert Sawyer, a good friend of the Institute, Jerry Sawyer also writes for us, the Sawyers, wrote a really good piece at the Imaginative Conservative defending my position. And one thing I will say about that piece, because of editing and other things, it was put together in a couple of phrases didn't come out exactly the way I wanted because of editing. And that's okay. I mean, this stuff happens. But people did zero in on one of those phrases in particular that did cause Anton to... was one barb that he threw my way. That, again, because of editing and because of the collaborative effort in that editing process, these things got missed a little bit. And that's okay. I mean, it's not a big deal. But I like this piece by Robert Sawyer because he points out that the 1776 Commission was a bad deal from the beginning. Why? Because it codifies this ridiculous proposition nation myth. And that's exactly what the Lincoln was doing at Gettysburg. It's exactly what people have done with the Declaration. There was actually an interesting piece in the AP News Service about how this phrase, all men are created equal, has created such a stir. And it wasn't intended to do anything that it's done. But this is exactly where the West Coast Straussians go with it. They take that line, DiLorenzo points this out in Lincoln's repudiation of the Declaration of Independence, and they run with it. And of course, that's the exact thing that the left have been doing for years. If you take that line and you believe that all men are created equal from the Declaration, then you are essentially a 19th century leftist. You're not really a conservative at all. And you're conserving leftism in America. That's the point. And so Sawyer defends yours truly. But I also think there's some really good parts of this post where he's not just defending me. He's also saying the exact same thing, right? He asks, to return to the point, just what does equality mean to Mr. Anton's estimation? That all Homo sapiens are equally Homo sapiens, as has been established through rational satisfaction by modern biology, is hardly a momentous proposition. What is its upshoot? Without more, the biological fact of human equality as a proposition delivers no more ethical instruction than the observation that all mammals are equally mammalian. Is it right and just to treat a stranger equivalent to a sibling, at least to the extent of so-called self-evident natural rights? Or is it a moral imperative to destroy all unconsented to hierarchies? That Michael Anton does not seem to recognize a philosophical chasm between himself and the deplorables of all description is not really a strike against him or his endeavor. He appears to be trying to mend bridges in good faith, and everyone is left feeling one's way in times like these. More disturbing, however, is a dead spot he seems to have regarding political theory in one very particular American narrative. He purports not to understand why vilifying Lincoln looms so important for many on the right. Yet his bafflement is itself mystifying. In truth, the only way the American Civil War means what Mr. Anton's mentor Harry Joffer purported it to mean is if the United States is viewed as a unitary state and ideological regime. Otherwise, the war can only be seen as loyal Southerners and the unblinkered see it, the conquest of one country by another. This is contra America's Unite. Lincoln did not try to avoid the Civil War. If he had tried, he would have succeeded. He would have simply created and negotiated with officials from the Confederate States of America on the matters in dispute, and the crisis would have passed, akin to the Brexit movement. Secession from the Constitutional Union was, after all, accomplished in terms of legitimization in much the same manner as accession to it. Instead, in Lincoln's pseudo-legal estimation, secession was a nullity, and the Confederate States of America didn't exist, technically because the Union pre-existed and overarched not only the Constitution, but all its constituent states. So that's the point. I mean, this is what he says. He can't get it. The real issue is Lincoln. It comes down to Lincoln and Lincoln's actions in 1861 to 1865. And not just that, Lincoln's words and what he said. This is really where the issue comes down to. It's why the 1776 Commission report can never work, because you're taking a 19th century leftist position, and particularly a unitary position, and trying to apply it to a federal republic, and a federal republic that didn't believe what Lincoln was selling majority-wise in this particular time period. So I like that Sawyer brings this up. If we can't get Lincoln straight, we can't get American history right. If we can't get American history right, we're doomed, because we play right into the hands of the left. The problem with the 1619 Commission, or 1619 report, or 1619 project, is not that it attempts to distort American history. The problem is it buys right into an already existing distortion, and that is the proposition nation. In fact, it says it. Nicole Hannah-Jones says it in her first piece. Her father would fly the U.S. flag, and he was very proud of it, and he was very proud of it because of the proposition nation. She said, if this is true, then everything America has done has betrayed this, if that's true. And so that's the issue. It buys right into the proposition nation myth. And so because of that, the Straussians, West Coast Straussians at Hillsdale and American Greatness and everywhere else, all these people are basically just two sides of the same coin. And they don't understand the original founding position, which is why Sawyer says we didn't need the 1776 Commission anyways. We didn't need it. It was a worthless exercise. And of course, Biden scrapped it, and I said, well, look, that's good. That's good he scrapped it. This was bad history from the beginning. Now, we know that particular kind of history is now being foisted on schools in Florida, because I've seen the slides, right? People have sent these to me. Well, look what they're doing in Florida now. And we know in South Carolina, this is the thing. South Carolina passed a law that made it mandatory for schools to teach the founding documents. Well, okay, that sounds great in theory, but how are they teaching it? Is it going to be from a West Coast Straussian position? Is it going to be from a leftist position? Is it going to be, well, here's your founding document. Look, it's all racist, sexist, whatever, class content, whatever it is. Are they going to teach it that way? Are they going to teach it that, they're teaching it, but they're teaching it from their own slant? It'd be better just to not even have them teach it at all, if that was the case. And, maybe introducing it to people is something else. We're introducing it to people, and so that's going to be a good thing for us. But maybe introducing it to them, that's okay. But if they're going to get this very Straussian or leftist slant to it, maybe that's not a good idea. So all these things sound good in theory. We're going to make sure that people get the founding documents. We're going to make sure that people get American history. But again, what's the slant? Is it 19th century liberal? And I've seen the slides coming out of this thing from the West Coast Straussians in Florida, and it's nothing that the liberals wouldn't have said about 50 years ago. This is why conservatives, what Dabney said, conservatism is just basically, American conservatism is whatever the left discarded 50 years ago. Now they take it as their own. In this case, it's about 150 years ago, but they're still taking it as their own. This American conservatives in the mainstream are taking leftists from the mid-19th century and saying these people are conservative. What about Calhoun? What about the Southern tradition? Anton will say, well, I invite Southerners into this because, you all are wrong on these other things, but I invite you to come into this, see the light of the Yankees and Lincolnianism. It's the best way. It's the only thing. Well, how about you go back further than that and start looking at the Jeffersonian Republicans and the tertium quids, and look at these people, and start basing an American conservatism on that rather than on Lincoln, which was a distortion, as DiLorenzo again points out, of the Declaration of Independence. And if the piece we ran on Thursday, The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the Origins of Southern Constitutionalism by John Remington Graham, this is from our 2004 summer school, so almost 20 years ago. We've had some great summer schools, and again, we're at the summer school right now, some great summer schools in the history of the Abbeville Institute. And we're going to continue to do things like this in the for the foreseeable future. But the summer schools are a wonderful opportunity to get some really good stuff. And of course, we have all of these lectures in audio form on the website, and we also have many of them in that we've recorded with video on the YouTube channel, so you can go out and watch that. But the audio lectures are also available on the app. If you download the app, you get the audio lectures. But what we're doing is we're having somebody go out and transcribe these, so we can have them in written form as well, so people can go, if they don't want to listen to it, they don't want to take the time, maybe they don't want to put it on in the car or watch it on their computer or whatever the case may be, they can simply print out the text of these things. They can read it, maybe take a little while to read it, go through it, and not have to take notes on it that way. So it's another opportunity for people to have these. And again, this isn't free for us to do this kind of thing. So if you like that part of it too, consider that donation. But the one thing that I think John Remington Graham does here is really show this continuity between 1688 and, of course, the belief in Southern constitutionalism. There certainly was that there. I mean, you can't get around in America this continuity between the 17th century and, of course, into the 18th century and then into the 19th century. It certainly is a direct line. And Southerners talked about this. I mean, we know the founding generation talked about it. The ancient constitutions, Patrick Henry brought this up. The ancient constitutions were things like the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. That was important stuff. And so with Henry bringing these things up and showing that continuity, I think this is something that we have to always explain about the Southern tradition. It's not just a 4-year period of history. The Southern tradition is older than America even. It goes back to 1215 at Runnymede. It's the Anglo-American tradition. It's all of that wrapped up into it. And so Southerners in 1861 going off to fight for their independence, in their minds, were doing the exact same thing that their forefathers had done in 1776. They were doing the exact same things that the English had done at Runnymede, or maybe even in the English Civil War, or any of these grand events. They were fighting for these rights of Englishmen. And when they talked about things like Anglo-Saxon blood after the war was over, because they said these things a lot. And of course, people talked about that in the 19th century. It wasn't about a particular race. It wasn't white people. Anglo-Saxonism was a particular culture. And I think that's, interesting. They actually differentiated between Anglo-Saxons and other white Europeans. This was a particular type of European culture that had been born and had fostered the spirit of independence and self-government and what they had in America. The French were also white Europeans, but they weren't Anglo-Saxons. So for example, the Greeks were also white Europeans, but they weren't Anglo-Saxons. The Italians were white Europeans, but they weren't Anglo-Saxons. They had a different political culture. The Spanish were certainly white Europeans, but they weren't Anglo-Saxons. So all of that, and even the Irish were white Europeans, but they weren't Anglo-Saxons. So you have this differentiation based on culture. This is what people miss. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was called a pure expression of Anglo-Saxonism by him, one speech. So does that make Lincoln, somehow tied into this white supremacy and whiteness? But I find this fascinating because people just reflexive, that means white people. But it's a particular culture. And it's a particular culture that fostered this kind of government that we saw in America in the spirit of resistance, which was important to the founding generation and also important to the generation who supported secession in the South and those that were in favor of Southern independence in the North in 1861. They talked about it. One of my favorite examples of this, too, where people, were not hypersensitive to this term was Robert Ballard. If you don't know who Robert Ballard is the guy that found the Titanic. And Robert Ballard wrote a book about it. And one of the first lines of the book is that this was the Titanic was a beautiful expression of Anglo-Saxon engineering, right? So does that mean it's, he's a racist for saying this? Of course not. He's talking about English-American engineering. And, the English and the Americans have long been a seafaring people, and that was part of it. So I love, this particular piece by John Remington Graham and how he gets into the origins of the Southern constitutional thought going back to the 17th century. And then, last but not least, we wrapped up the week with a little short essay on the attack on Leviathan, which, of course, is a great book. And the author of this, Chase Steele, found this book, an old copy of it, in a little bookstore for $6. It was a first edition copy, and he went through and it was signed, and it's a wonderful find, and it's, of course, Donald Davidson. And he's going to go through for the next few weeks and talk about the book itself and what's in it. But his little story about how he found this book and who it belonged to is pretty amazing. And so he says this will be the first of a series of essays on this. And we're going to carry all the essays. He's going to go through it. And I like it when people have these kind of things that let us print it on the Institute website, because a lot of people are not academics, and they just go in. They want to read books that are appropriate for their worldview, and they want to know more about these things. And when you have someone like Chase, who is not an academic, he's just a curious reader, this shows that this stuff is working, right? I mean, people are finding these things. When they find these things, it's like a light goes off, and it's amazing for them. So we look forward to more installments in this series by Chase Steele and his contributions to the website. And Chase is just a really interesting guy. If you follow him on social media, he's a lot of fun to follow. But regardless, hope you enjoyed this week in review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.